So I'm going to start recording and I'm going to let folks in. It looks like right now we have 41 people in the waiting room, which is phenomenal. Good evening, everybody. We're just going to wait a few minutes here to make sure everybody gets settled and gets their camera set up and make sure that they're muted. And then we will kick things off.
I'm trying to get, oh, there's Diane.
And a good evening to everybody. Happy Monday. I am Deb Cravoy. I am the director of the Pioneer Valley Jewish Film Festival and also the COO of the Springfield JCC in Springfield, Mass. And we are thrilled to welcome you to this evening's conversation with Stephen Glantz about the award-winning drama Crescendo. We're so thrilled to have Stephen with us tonight to share his reflections and tell us a little bit of the inside scoop of what it was like working on this film from start to finish. We are now more than halfway through this virtual festival, and boy, the feedback has just been phenomenal. Thank you to all of you who have been watching films and joining conversations and just sharing words of appreciation. And even if you're sharing words of frustration about how do I get this tech to work, hopefully we've helped you solve your problems and challenges, and we're just delighted to have you with us. It's really been such a wonderful, wonderful experience being able to launch this program. Tonight's program, I'm pleased to announce, is sponsored by our friend Diane Trotterman, who's here with us tonight. And I want to thank Diane for her longtime support of the Jewish Film Festival and more broadly for arts and culture, particularly here in Western Massachusetts. So thanks, Diane. Thank you also to our festival-wide sponsors, the Springfield JCC, our presenting sponsor, the Jewish Federation of Western Mass, the Totsi Foundation, including the Schulman and Feldman families, the Basketball Hall of Fame, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, the Eisenberg School of Management at UMass, Lathrop Senior Living Communities, and the Tower Square Hotel. The festival continues all the way through March 22nd. We have 3 more films that you can check out on pvjff.org. For those of you who are already through this process, you know it's pretty easy. You click on the film that you're interested in. There's a green registration button that will take you to a page where you enter just a tiny bit of information, and then you'll be good to go. One soccer drama called The Keeper, which is very engaging and very entertaining, and 2 more documentaries in the mix. So check it all out at the website pvjff.org. So we're going to get going here. I hope you'll indulge me. I just want to remind everyone to kindly keep themselves muted. That'll just help streamline things and let Stephen not have any background noise as a distraction. As far as the tonight's presentation, we are recording it. I saw a question in the chat about that, and we will absolutely be recording tonight's session. So if you have friends who weren't able to join tonight, they can email info@pvjff.org, and we're happy to share the recording link. That's been a really fun way for folks to feel like they can still participate. Let's see, if you have questions, after Stephen finishes his presentation, we're going to open it up for a lively Q&A. And if you have questions, you're just going to type them into the chat function. The chat is at the very bottom bar of the Zoom screen with kind of a bubble above it. It'll open up a little window. You'll chat your question, type it in. It'll come directly to me. I'm going to help organize all the questions, and then I will relay them to Stephen. So I certainly encourage you to do that along the way, and we're going to have a really wonderful back and forth. So without any further ado, it is really my great pleasure to introduce our friend Stephen Glantz, who is an award-winning screenwriter and author. His book, Clara's War, published in the US by HarperCollins, has been translated into 21 languages and was named a Sophie Brody Honor Book by the American Library Association. His work is international in scope. He's collaborated with producers and directors throughout the US, in Great Britain, Germany, France, Israel, Poland, the Czech Republic, and China. For the past 20 years, most of his work has focused on race, genocide, politics, and young people in areas of conflict. And you can certainly see how that plays out in the script for Crescendo, which we'll be talking about tonight. Since 2000, Stephen has worked extensively in Germany for Arthur Bronner, Alice Bronner, and their company, CCC Filmkunst. Besides Crescendo, CCC has produced 5 of Stephen's scripts. He's been a scholar in residence at Brandeis. He's taught at Williams College. And currently he's on the faculty at Emerson College in Boston, where he teaches writing the film adaptation, writing the movie musical, writing the social justice film, as well as graduate level screenwriting. So please, as I've been so fond of saying, put your muted hands together for our presenter, Stephen Glantz. Stephen, take it away.
Okay, well, hi everybody. The first thing I'm going to say is I'll probably get pretty emotional tonight. I just been thinking a lot about 3 of the people who are my mentors that passed away this year. They're Yvonne Passer, a Czech director who introduced me to Mr. Brenner, Mark Crowley, who got me my first job, who wrote Boys in the Band, and then, of course, Arthur. But anyway, so how I got to Arthur is really sort of a crazy story of luck and one of those accidents. Yvonne was the first person to ever hire me to work on a movie in 1974 when he was doing a comedy with Carol O'Connor and Ernest Borgnine, and I was the set PA. And then we both moved to California at the same time, and we wanted to find something to work together on. Pardon?
Is this interesting?
They're just starting.
Well, they started, they said something.
If everyone can just kindly mute themselves, if you're logging in late, just please make sure that you click on the mute button in the bottom left corner of the Zoom screen. Thank you.
Well, anyway, so Yvonne and I did a movie at NBC, and then they took out a scene that we had contractually made them leave in the movie. And so we were really angry, and he had me write a letter to the head of GE. And so I kind of got fired from my other job at NBC, and Yvonne felt really bad. So he was doing this movie in Berlin with this guy, Arthur Browner, that I had never heard of. And it was sort of a variation on the Golem story. So Arthur and Yvonne naturally had a fight. They're both a little pugnacious about money. So he left the project and I sort of stayed. And then he asked me if I wanted to write, like I wrote one sort of small circus movie for him. And then he asked me if I wanted to write a movie about Babi Yar, which is the massacre of 35,000 Jews outside of Kiev. And I said, what are you, out of your mind? Are you crazy? I'm like a middle-class Jewish kid from Providence, Rhode Island, and I didn't know anybody personally. I mean, I knew people, but I wasn't connected to the Holocaust in any direct way. And he kept pestering me. So finally, he said, well, come to Berlin, bring your wife, bring your kid, and you'll just do the research for a couple of months and then we'll see. So it was a free trip to Berlin, staying in a nice hotel. So, you know, it was hard to say no to. But I still felt at the end of 3 months that I didn't know a way to do it. I couldn't find a way in for myself. And, you know, like when you're a writer, a screenwriter, like you take pretty much any job and then you figure out, you know, how to get excited about it. But like with the Shoah, you just can't bullshit, you know, so you really have to be there. So finally, I was really desperate, and I had a carol at the library in Berlin, and I was looking at books in Russian, which I don't speak, to look at the pictures. And there's one book, and it was published by the Soviet Union, by the Soviet press. And they didn't identify any of the victims as Jews, but it was basically like a high school yearbook, only there are 35,000 photographs in it. Nobody, you know, not like the classic Holocaust pictures of horrible, horrible images, but everyday people, weddings, bar mitzvahs, school recitations, you know, picnics, family pictures, and it kind of like split my head open. And I realized that, oh my gosh, this 6 million isn't just a number. So we did Baba Yar, and Artur had done, I mean, he did the first Holocaust film in 1946.
Oh, you didn't see the analysis. You didn't. He's just doing this.
Could everybody just please mute themselves?
You always say you see.
No. Thank you. And he had done the first Holocaust film in 1946. He was a Polish Jew. He had lost 12 people at Baba Yar. He lost like 48 family members altogether. To be around him was amazing. You know, we wrote daily for like 15 years until he was sort of too old to work anymore. But he knew all, you know, in all the movies and all that we wrote together, he had a personal connection to them, and he was very cagey about it. Like he just wouldn't come out and say, this was my uncle, or this was my son, or this was my brother. And I could see that this, you know, the Holocaust like existed in his mind. In his 90s, he could only sleep 3 hours a night and still had nightmares. So by being with Artur, who became sort of I don't know, like they just adopted me into their family, I felt like I belonged to the Holocaust and the Holocaust belonged to me. And he was a great man. He made over like 250 films, all of which was to make the money to finance the 23 Holocaust films he made. Like there's a room in Yad Vashem named after him, and all his films are sort of distributed worldwide by the Goethe Society. So, you know, by working with Artur, it sort of changed my outlook on life. And like him, he was just really worried more about future generations not knowing about what had happened in the Shoah. And he was really he just died in 2019, like almost 101, and he was active working, would still be talking about movies until the final year of his life. And he was angry, and he was so full of life and love and energy. I'd never been around this kind of life force before. So, like, I'm really proud to sort of taken up his mantle of who's going to continue this work. And now I'm lucky to be working with his daughter, Elise, who's a kid at 50, who's such a talented producer. And the difference between Arthur and Elise is sort of very interesting if you look at sort of how, my film over the course of the years have evolved. Arthur was so dark. And he was haunted by the images of the Shoah, and he wanted them in his films. And sort of around 2008, 2010, after we'd done a few of them, like, it's hard to face taking on one of these projects, because that you're going to have to go through hell to get it right, and it's going to be really hard to get them financed, and is it really worth it anyway? You feel like you're out in the middle of the desert just screaming, and you don't know if anybody's going to hear you. But Elise had kind of a different, not a different viewpoint, but she was just filled with light. And so, like, the movie which really sort of changed was this film called Auf das Leben, to life. And it was a film about a German cabaret singer who wouldn't leave Berlin after the war. And I know I'm jumping a little all over the place here. But the original character in that movie was based on his wife's childhood in Poland when she was on the run from the Nazis. And he made a film about it with his niece Sharon. It's very, I wouldn't say incestuous, but it's really a family enterprise over there. And the original drafts of Auf das Leben were very dark, and Elise just came in when she took over the project and said, "This is crazy. We have to, why can't there be a Holocaust film with a happy, hopeful ending?" And that was kind of a transformational moment for me in sort of giving up my dark side about the Holocaust. Okay, so now I'm going to start. And that really sort of changed how I approach writing Crescendo. When we started, we wrote the first draft in 2011, and how that came about was I was in Berlin, and we were having lunch, like everything was around meals. And he said that he had this crazy idea that he had back in the 50s or early 60s about a Palestinian Israeli or an Arab Israeli orchestra. And he said he actually paid some writer to come up with a story, but he said it was terrible. And I looked at it, and it was terrible, and we agreed that we needed to begin. And you have to remember that this was before Barenboim's West-East Divan Orchestra. So when we started working on the film in 2010, we certainly aware of Barenboim's orchestra, and we had to decide, do we want to do that film? And what we felt was that any film, with Barenboim in it would have to be about Barenboim. I mean, he was such a dynamic character that he would dominate everything. And we wanted to do a movie mostly about the young people. But just because we didn't want to be accused of ripping off Barenboim, Arthur or Elise, got in touch with him, and he sort of gave us his blessing. So when we started in 2011, the sort of political situation in Israel and Palestine was really, really horrible. I mean, there were lots of bombings, lots of terror, and that kind of influenced the early drafts. And there was always a tension in the writing of the script of like, how are you going to end it? Are people going to die? What's the tone going to be? And so I started doing research. And I mean, I use the word interesting, but it was really kind of depressing that a lot of the Palestinian contacts that I had both here in the country in Israel and in the West Bank, like I didn't know anybody in Gaza. A lot of people were just very reluctant to even talk to me because they were afraid if it got back to the community that they were collaborating with, Jews about a project, it could affect them and their families. So with some of my sources, I had to basically promise them that I would never reveal who they were. And that really hit me in the process, because all of a sudden it wasn't, we're just not telling a story, we're not just making a movie, but the consequences of the film, of making the film, could be very, dangerous, and we're just making a movie. So that kind of cast not an aura about it, but it sort of created this space around making the movie that we couldn't allow it not to be true, even though we're fictionalizing most of it. So over the course, the first person that we went to direct it was the current director, Dror Zahavi. And in the early drafts, I won't sort of discuss the details of it, but Archer, even though I was against it, there was a bombing, because there were bombings all the time. But when you put a bombing in a movie, there are also consequences to that. But because just by having a bomb go off, it means that somebody put it there, and who were they? And the story becomes about the violence rather than about the people. And Dror just said, no, I'm not going to do it. There's not going to be a bomb ever in any one of my movies. And so then we went to Marcus Rosenmuller, who directed our film Wunderkinder, who's really an incredible guy. But I always was kind of uneasy about any kind of violence, and so was Marcus. And there wasn't tension, but there's a certain kind of responsibility that you have when you're making a film. And for some, for scheduling reasons, Marcus had to leave, and we went back to Dror, and he wanted to focus the film more about the musicians. And a lot of the early drafts, which was sort of based a lot on the research about West East Divan Orchestra, were about sort of the politics between both Palestinian government and the Israeli government, just about the logistics of how are these musicians going to work together. There's like a 300-page security document. And so in earlier drafts, there were all these sort of negotiation between the governments, and thank God Dror said, what are you, out of your mind? We got to get rid of all those. And originally, we wanted to shoot the film in Yalta, because that's where Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had that famous meeting at the end of World War II. But then the Russians invaded the Crimea, and so we couldn't shoot there. So then we set it in Potsdam, and then eventually, in Austria, where where it was so beautiful. When we were getting the cast together, there was we had all wanted the musicians to really be able to play, because it just makes all the difference in the world, especially when you have like 20 or 30 people. The four cast members, Daniel, well, I'll give you their character names. Ron, Layla, Omar, and Shira were not professional musicians. They were actors. But all the other musicians were musicians and not actors. And one of the ironies of putting together the movie was that, just as in real life, when they were putting together the West East Divan Orchestra, there were plenty of Israelis who were really great musicians. They had access to a history of playing. They had great teachers. They could afford instruments, and as soon as you went to the West Bank, there weren't many teachers. There weren't many. The children had no instruments to play, and it was very hard to find the Palestinian musicians, which was really reflected in the story. And then when we started rehearsals, Dror had the actors go through many of the same prejudice reduction exercises that were in the film. And so when we started shooting, we thought the shooting would go pretty smoothly, because the rehearsals, had gone well. But when we started shooting, what happened was that the musicians weren't acting anymore. Like, every one of those musicians had lost somebody in their family, knew somebody, who had died, who'd gone to jail. So they weren't acting. And it got to be so intense in shooting some of those scenes that that they had to call off shooting. A couple of the actresses just fainted. It was so intense. But one of the things that Dror was really able to do was sort of keep, the actors just together, and to get rid of, I don't know. I mean, it's a miracle to me how they actually did this film and not really hurt each other. I thought that the acting was amazing to me. It's always a revelation. Like, when you write something, it's almost an act of faith. Like, you never know if if the actors are going to do it right, if the director's going to do it right. I mean, I've been really lucky with all the Browner films. Like, the directors and the cast have been great, except for one, but we won't go into that. And I'm always surprised by how wonderful they come out, because what you see on the screen is so much more than you ever imagined in your mind. It's like when you're a writer, you're kind of a control freak, and you just see everything, said in a particular way, like the actors when they say their lines, the characters, you even know where they're going to pause to breathe when you're writing it. And the this cast especially, and I think one of the phenomenon was that because Ron, Daniel Donsky, and Layla Sabrina Amali were so good, that they raised the level of performances of all the other non-professional actors. Like you couldn't, all of a sudden, you're saying lines, and when those two get started, it's not lines, it's real. I don't know that I want to say too much more about the film. I do want to, how much time do we have? What time is it?
It's just a little past 7:30. We're good.
Okay, yeah. I mean, there are a couple more things before we open it up that I really wanted to say about Archer. And I mean, this is sort of I don't know that you would call it a fun fact, but it sort of says something about who he was. Like after the war, he started buying up real estate in Berlin because it was, it was really, really cheap. And he bought a poison gas factory, and that's what he turned into his movie studio. So his life was sort of guided by, taking the real crap and the horror of the Holocaust and kind of transforming it. I mean, one of the things I really learned from him is that, when you tell these stories, it's like a long haul, like you're never done telling them. I mean, with a lot of filmmakers or American filmmakers, and this is not to criticize anybody, but like Spielberg did Schindler's List, and so he did his Holocaust film, and Roman Polanski did, The Pianist, and he sort of did his Holocaust film. So for Browner, I mean, it was a mission, and I mean, his legacy is, it's not the money he's made, although he made a ton of it, and it's not, the famous people that he hung out with, and I mean, it was like he was living and breathing to tell these stories. Like I would get phone calls in the middle of the night from Berlin, or a fax, and he said, we just have to do this next one, and would look at each other, and it's like, oh my God, no, not another one. Can we do anything else? But at the end of the day, you can't turn your back on telling these stories, because in turning your back on even telling one, you're sort of turning your back on all of them. So I guess, in this year of COVID, and especially with Archer, Ivan, and my other friend Mart just passing away in a year, you just kind of become very thoughtful about your life and your legacy. And one of the things I'm most grateful to Archer for is for getting me into this kind of work, because I do feel I'm carrying on his work, and personally, like, my kids are really proud of what I do, and that's an amazing feeling for a parent. And I guess one more thing before we open it up for questions, is that people always asking me, like, how can you stand it? How do you just go to these depressing places every day? But at the end of the day, it's like, what I feel now is like I'm not necessarily writing about Germans and Jews. I mean, and you're not just writing about death. I mean, what you're really writing about is in these times, it's like people are experiencing the most love that they've ever felt in their lives for their, for their husbands and wives and their children. So, I mean, I'm telling a lot of love stories, and that's how you kind of have to frame it or look at it. And it's, and I mean, the difference between my career now and, my previous career in LA is that, I know, like you can't, like you could phone it in sometimes when you're working on a TV show or you're doing a TV movie. It's like this kind of work is much more demanding, and so you can't phone it in, and that's another reason that I like doing it. Okay.
Thank you, Stephen.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome.
And thanks everybody for typing some questions into the chat. We're going to open it up for a little back and forth here, and I will kick things off. A couple of questions came in sort of tied around the same general area of inquiry.
I'll bet you $20 I know what it is.
All right. Okay, we'll see here. So,
Okay.
the job of the writer is to obviously make very important decisions around plot.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly one of the big results is the decision to have Omar, the character of Omar, killed.
Mm.
And so several people wrote in about that very plot point. And the questions pretty much revolve around why the decision to kill Omar and not Shira, for example. And that this was from Mark, asked this question. And he writes, the only real ambiguity in the film for me was Omar's death. Why so ambiguous? And then another question related from Robert, why did the boy have to die? So if you can share a little bit of insight about what led you to, what led the writing team to that eventual plot point.
Yeah, I mean, the ending was the hardest thing to sort of be revealed to us or for us to kind of figure out. I mean, there's this idea of something called redemptive filmmaking, redemptive storytelling, and it was basically a critique of sort of American films and Hollywood films, and that no matter how horrible things are in the film, something happens, the character's redeemed, he has a revelation, his life has changed, people have their lives changed, and people don't die, and everybody walks out of the theater happy or feeling good. And I knew, Archer knew, and everybody else in the writing, you cannot write a film like this and have it be real if there aren't real consequences. Like when Barenboim's put together his orchestra, I mean, there were huge protests in the street, which we didn't get into in this film, which there were some in earlier drafts. There are many more death threats, which we didn't put into this movie. And the reason that we made it ambiguous is that if we knew who was responsible for the killing of Omar, then who was it? What were the politics of the group? Why did they kill him? I mean, could it, if it was a right-wing sort of anti-peace group, that's what the movie would become about. If it was, right-wing anti-peace Jews, that's what the movie would have become about. If it was, terrorists who didn't want any what they would call collusive activity between Jews and Palestinians. That's what the movie would come about. And in real life, a lot of times we don't know who's responsible for things, and that's why we had it take place in the dark. We didn't want to have any blood, any gore. We didn't want to see a dead body. That's not what the movie is about. And there's kind of like a pornography of violence that we really wanted to avoid at all costs, especially in telling this story. But Omar, he was perhaps the most innocent of all, of all the characters. And if you remember that Herman Melville novel, Billy Budd, he was a young kid who went to sea and he ends up dying. It's always the most innocent who suffer. And that's the tragedy of life and the tragedy of these kinds of stories. And I mean, it just wouldn't have been an honest film if we avoided the consequences of what this kind of activity brings up in other people.
Yeah, it's interesting. Several people actually just shared in the chat that they thought that the death of Omar's character was necessary in light of or someone's death, in light of the real situation. Yeah. And I guess as an extension of that, Stephen, Diane writes, did you have this ending in mind when you first wrote the script, or did it evolve?
No, I mean, this particular ending evolved over time. Sort of the politics changed. I mean, I think there was always a tension, not like anger tension, but creative tension from the beginning, like how we knew that something bad had to happen, and we didn't know what the scale would be, and if, without going in particulars, like if there's a larger scale event, it just kind of totally took over. I mean, it really took over the movie. And so we discarded that. But I mean, in a lot of films, like the ending doesn't get decided until almost the end. And like, I don't know how many drafts I did and what the other writers did, that probably had to be like 15, 20 altogether. So, you just sort of go by what your gut is. I mean, you can't be reasonable about writing a story like this. You're kind of feeling your way along, and you try a lot of things, and some work and a lot of them don't work. And Omar was he was such a lovable kid. And the actor, Maher, was delightful.
Thank you. A couple of other questions have come in, so I'm just going to take a little turn. So obviously you've referenced Barenboim and the Divan Orchestra, mm-hmm. which obviously was a very ambitious project to bring together musicians from across the Middle East and to have this cultural exchange that felt like an important piece of dialogue through music. Mm-hmm. Wendy writes, when you decided to make this film, given that the documentary Knowledge is the Beginning was actually made about the divan, about the orchestra itself.
Sure, yeah.
what was your process for thinking about what you wanted to do differently that would complement the actual story, um, particularly in light of the fact that there was this documentary out there in existence?
It's a great question. One of the main things that we felt that we wanted to do, like, you didn't see any of the musicians' families in the documentary, or as I remember it. And we especially wanted to see what was going on the Palestinian side. One of the criticisms, I don't know if it was a criticism, but some people felt that we spent more time with the Palestinian families than the Israeli families. In the original scripts, it was like 50-50. I mean, like almost counting the words. But one of the things that I really admire about Dror was that he felt that, especially in the West and in the US, we're much more familiar with the US side, and that in films, the Palestinians we never really got to know their families. I mean, we really see them more. I mean, if you look at a lot of Israeli films and television, like most of the directors there are pretty left wing, and you, like, if you look at series like Fauda and some other great TV series, there's a lot more of everyday life of the Palestinians, and so that's why, you know, this film might be seen to be slanted a little bit, but I mean, we tried to be fair, but we also felt unless we were really pissing somebody off, like everybody off, we weren't doing a good job. I mean, when we were trying to get the financing, a lot of people said, no, we can't do this, it's too pro-Palestinian. Other people said, oh, we can't do this, it's too pro-Israeli. So that was I guess a sign that the script was working.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to take a turn here. A couple of questions came in about the music itself, and two questions that I'll pair together. One is if you have any insight into the music selection process, how the pieces were chosen for what was going to be played by the orchestra members. And then related to that, by the end of the film, in terms of, you know, the whole production process, what were the relationships like between the non-actor musicians?
Okay, so we knew, like, I knew when I was writing the early drafts that whatever I put in would be, you know, was my musical taste. But I think as the story sort of focused more on the musicians, I mean, somebody had the bright idea, let's just look at this logically and select music that people thrown together, and some, you know, the level of artistry, you know, was probably going to vary. They would pick sort of pieces that weren't really complicated or overly sophisticated. I mean, that's why they did Pachelbel's Canon. With Bolero, we didn't know what the hell to do at the end of the movie. And it was Elise who figured that out. I mean, she just saw on a YouTube video, you know, like, they weren't Jews and they weren't Palestinians, but there's this window in an airport with some people on one side and people on another, and like just Bolero came into her head, and that's how we selected it. I mean, so it was almost an accident. The relationships between the musicians was good. We haven't done any like formal follow-up, so we don't know how many of the friendships were sustaining. But with the West East Divan Orchestra, a lot of them moved to Berlin, and a lot of them live in the same neighborhood and on the same street in Oranienburg. And I think, God, I mean, they're still there. I was just looking at their schedule, and they're going to be around a lot, in summer.
Yeah, and they've been here. If I'm not mistaken, if
Yeah.
somebody can put in the chat, I'm pretty sure they've played at the Fine Arts Center in Amherst, within the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they're not kids anymore.
Yeah, pretty impressive. Speaking of impressive, just a couple of comments that have come in, just people wanting to share some of their own observations about the film with you. Barbara writes, I really want to praise the look of the film. It is beautifully directed with impressive locations and beautiful acting. Betty writes, I thought the film was so compelling. Uh, and it does have, even for folks who were watching this instead of watching it together at Cinemark on a super large screen, even for folks who are watching it at home, there is just a visual beauty to it. I mean, the
Yeah. Oh
location, I think
gosh.
the location contributes so much. And I'm wondering if maybe you can just touch on a little bit more about, I know you talked about you wanted that original location and then you landed where you landed, but
Well, I mean, the
what did it
location
offer?
is um, it's kind of funny. So the way you get films financed is that there are like these film boards in all over Europe, and within different countries, different areas of the country have their own film board. So even though we were in the Alps and it was supposed to be Austria, was actually shot in Italy, and one of the Italian film boards said, okay, if you shoot here, we'll give you some money. And so that's why we ended up with those beautiful locations in the mountains. And then, I mean, this is under the category of why getting any movie made is a miracle. We were all set to go into production, and then the money dropped out. Like, part of the budget dropped out, and Elise was at the Berlin Film Festival, and she was at a party, and she got the call that the money dropped out. And she was just there crying, and because she'd been like trying to get the financing literally for years, and this guy comes up to her and he says, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" And so she tells him the story of losing the money, and she tells him the story about what the movie is about. And this was the guy that owned Red Bull, and he said, "I'll give you the money." So I mean, it takes a miracle sometimes to get a movie made.
For sure, for sure. So thank you to my fact checker, Wendy, who said that in fact, Daniel Barenboim, has his traveling ensemble, that they were at the Fine Arts Center just a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's pretty awesome. Yeah, for folks in our audience tonight, the Fine Arts Center does a fabulous job. That big, beautiful structure on the UMass campus, just lots of tremendous talent. And a lot of Israeli musicians have been featured over the years, and a lot of interesting cross-cultural ensembles as well. Let me switch gears here. I have a question from Joe, who writes, why was the Israeli-Palestinian peace concert initiated by Germans as opposed to Israelis and or Palestinians?
Okay, so this gets back to the act of actual practical filmmaking. I mean, the West-East Divan was started by Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim. In this film, in Crescendo, there's a corporate culture of supporting cultural events. And you really didn't get this so much in the story, but for big corporations, it's kind of prestigious to sponsor something like a Palestinian-Israeli peace orchestra. I mean, that didn't come out so much in the story, but that was the reason for that.
All right, thank you.
And also because, you know, after the violence and the, you know, we needed something to sort of blow up the idea of the orchestra continuing, and it's just like, well, you know, like she's off to another cultural important cause.
So I wanted to ask a question about our lead actor, Peter, who some may know from the film festival circuit as quite an accomplished Austrian film actor. I'm wondering if
Tony Collette, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he also starred in The Interpreter, which was traveled on the Jewish Film Festival circuit 2-3 years back. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about any interactions that you had with him, or if there were, you know, at what point did you know he was being cast, and did that shift any of the screenwriting, knowing that he had come on?
No, I didn't, you know, I didn't personally interact with Peter at all. As a matter of fact, I mean, like, I'm a huge Gustavo Dudamel groupie. I mean, I'm more than a fan, and the original conductor was South American, but I knew that that was going to have to change and that he would have to be German. And I mean, it was Elise who really cast Peter. But in kind of a fun fact, I have this other movie that will be shot. It's an American movie that will be shot here, like hopefully in Rhode Island. We're scheduled to go in August or September. And he's being cast. I just found out like a couple of weeks ago that the director wanted to, like our casting agents wanted to cast him as this sort of Hungarian priest in the movie. And I said, are you kidding, Peter? And it was just like, oh my God, he's going to be in 2 movies. So I felt so lucky. In this movie, he plays a really bad guy.
Can you talk a little bit about, you know, often in films like this, you know, there are very important decisions that get made around, you know, does English become the bridge language, right? And how you're then handling kind of what's happening in one's native language, and how you handle that from a subtitle perspective. I'm just curious, as the film has been shown in different parts of the world, do you feel like it shifts dramatically? Because obviously there's a lot of languages spoken throughout the course of the film.
I mean, that was done to make it feel like a real story. Like, we knew that, you know, they'd be speaking German, Arabic, Hebrew, and English. And so we had, you know, all the conversations that would in real life be in those languages were going to be in those languages. And sometimes, you know, it's a pain in the ass, but it's really important. Like, one of my problems basically with all subtitled movies is that there are these companies that do the subtitles. And, you know, in the English parts, I mean, it was crazy not to use the English words, you know, instead of having somebody translate the words sometimes to the subtitles. I mean, the script was originally written all in English, and then it had to be translated, you know, into German. And then as German writers sort of got involved, and then you know, that's why there are so many writers. I mean, we needed all those languages to be represented and represented well.
Thank you. Thank you. Just some very lovely comments. People have just been thrilled to hear your sensitive responses tonight. Just really appreciate all of these wonderful backstories. I mean, it really is it is a treat when we have somebody who's part of the production team who really has the inside story, and the fact that, you know, there's this, Barenboim exists as the touch point, but the way in which the whole team was able to just build and make this into its own is very, very powerful. So thank you for being so accessible to us, Stephen.
Oh,
Really a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Diane Trotterman, for ensuring that this was a film that we could really spotlight and bring to the Valley. So important. And you know, we hope that you'll come back when you have new projects. We hope that we can showcase things. Do you have anything coming down the pike that you want to let us know about, just as we close out here?
This movie, well, hopefully we'll be doing this Golem movie that we started in the year 2000. Hopefully we might shoot that here in the next year or so, like in the Berkshires. But I'm not going to say too much about it because I'll jinx it. So there's this movie Rialto that was, you know, that Peter is going to play a part in, and it's a noir movie about a woman, you know, from Europe who owns an art house theater in a college town in Rhode Island. And it's kind of it's noir, but I mean, the director is Lizzie Borden, who is sort of a cult director. She did Working Women, about, you know, a brothel in New York City, and she did this incredible movie Women in Flames, which she worked on for 4 years in the early 80s. And so Lizzie and I have been working on this for a long time. She's just out there, so it'll be a lot of fun. And then there's a project about Elizabeth Freeman that we might be turning into a TV series, who's the first Black woman to sue for her freedom in 1781. And that is another local story that happened in Great Barrington in Sheffield.
Wow. All right. Well, we will keep tabs on your work, Stephen, and be sure to let folks know from the film festival community when projects are coming out. That sounds fabulous. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Thank you all for your wonderful support of our humble Valley Film Festival. We're working hard to keep everybody happy and engaged, especially during these times. And to have these kinds of conversations, it really extends the whole experience. So again, my great thanks to you,
really
Stephen,
nice
and everybody.
And so it's great that you support the PVFF.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Be well. Take care.